Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone. For this week's episode, I want to talk about ego and essentially what our ego is and how that plays out in our lives and in our minds. And so if you remember back on episode 22, if you listen to that one, I did touch on ego and how that can play out with some of the different farming practices. And I tied that back to some of the different decisions that I was making within that season of farming and some of the things that I was struggling with and the things that my ego was essentially playing into. But I've been here thinking about ego a lot more, and so I just figured I would touch back on this and I'll dive a little bit deeper into ego and my different thoughts on that. And so essentially, what is ego? And I kind of looked this up to see what the actual definition of it is. And ego is a person's sense of self, including their thoughts, feelings, self-esteem, and sense of self-importance. And so that's essentially what the definition is. But the way that I perceive ego is sometimes thinking that I'm in control, or maybe that I'm the reason for the success that I'm having. Ego, to me, can almost seem like sometimes when you got two voices in your head, you got maybe the angel and the devil. I'd say sometimes the ego is more the devil, and they tend to be a little bit louder. And so I think ego is just an interesting thing, and I always feel like we have this pretty negative thought on ego. I was asking myself, is your ego good or is it bad? I think that's something that can be debated. And so that's why I was trying to think through this as to what are my thoughts on ego. The one thing that I like here is I'm going to use this quote, and this came from the Way to Farm podcast from the Singular Agronomic guys over there. I got Ben and Josh Pretzer that do some work over there. And shout out to those guys. But Ben had this quote on this one podcast, and I thought it was very interesting. And he said, "The ego is the anesthesia that deadens the pain of stupidity." So I thought that was a pretty interesting quote when it comes to ego, and that's pretty blunt. But I definitely can relate to that in that particular episode, and I can relate to actually more or less back to the episode that I recorded, back to episode 22, where I talked about some different farming practices. I feel like we get caught up into living on this high hill of, going to die on this hill, going to die on this principle or this thing that we're trying to stand behind. For some people in the cropping world, you could talk about cover crops or tillage in this realm. And so we feel like we die on this hill. And sometimes when you step back and realize it's like, well, that's stupid. We're not willing to essentially give in. Our ego is the one that's controlling some of those thoughts. So for me, I want to talk about my ego a little bit, give you a little bit of a representation of what I was thinking about when I was coming up with this conversation. So as this sits, we're basically mid-October. We've had a really good harvest. It's been good as far as we've been able to get a lot done. We are almost wrapped up with harvest, whereas a lot of people are just starting corn or still wrapping up with beans. And so I think for me, I was actually thinking in my mind, you tend to get this thoughts of I'm in control or I'm the reason that we are where we are. And I think that's definitely your ego talking. And so for me, I was like, well, these are not thoughts I necessarily give a lot of weight to because I try to be somewhat humble in this, and I'll get into that. But essentially the thoughts that I was having was we've had very few breakdowns. So yay us or woe is us. And so I'm like, we're the reason that maybe we're better because we got higher yields or we're done with harvest sooner. Or like I mentioned, we had fewer breakdowns. And I feel like that is just your ego talking. And that is just essentially you being on your high horse. You've always mentioned this, you need to get off your high horse. So the phrase that I came up with is the higher the horse you're riding, the harder the fall when life happens. And so I'll repeat that. The higher the horse you're riding, the harder the fall when life happens. For me, I think I was definitely on a high horse. And so I had to sometimes keep myself in check. And it's good to keep people around you to keep yourself in check as well, because we all know that life's going to happen. And ultimately, the reason that you're maybe having some of that luck and that success is not generally because of your own doing, is like I mentioned before, is it's luck. Or maybe it's you're just blessed and it's ultimately God's doing. So I think we just tend to have that in our minds that we're better than somebody else. And I think that's whenever you get that thought in your head that you're better than somebody else, that is ultimately your ego talking. And your ego at one point or another can definitely steer you in the wrong direction. I just think that was very interesting when I was thinking about this whole ego thing at this point of harvest, where we're at. We're sitting pretty good, but at the end of the day, that's just our situation. That's just our context. So I thought that was very interesting. But also the reason I was thinking about ego was because I was listening into a conversation this last week talking about ego. And essentially what that conversation was, and to tie into the rest of this, is I mentioned before, it seems like there's two voices in our head or two people on our shoulders. We've got the angel and we've got the devil. Well, to kind of relate this back to what this conversation was, is we've got the voices in our head. One is your ego and one is God. And so the thing here that they mentioned is God tends to whisper, but the ego tends to scream. Well, which one's easier to hear? Well, obviously the screams. If you've got a kid that likes to whisper versus a kid that likes to scream, I can definitely tell you that you're going to pay more attention to the screams. And so it's harder to necessarily notice those whispers. It's harder to find a quiet place to be in, so that way you can pay attention to those whispers and actually hear what they really are. And so I thought that was pretty interesting, because when it comes to trying to listen to the voices in our head, you've got your ego and you've got God, and one whispers and one screams. So I thought that was a very interesting thought process there, because how relatable is that? If you think back to some different things that go on in your head, think back to sometimes that you've maybe tried to put yourself in a situation to listen to God, if you've been able to do that. And I can say that that's a lot easier said than done because of the noise of this world, because of all the distractions of this world. It's a lot harder to put ourselves in the situation to actually listen to those whispers. Because I don't know about you, but generally, in my opinion, God doesn't scream. I don't think that he does, because that would be too easy to hear and to follow those screams. So I think it's important for us to try to put ourselves in a position so we can actually try to listen to those whispers. So I also want to keep moving here as far as when it comes to ego. I mentioned, is it good or is it bad? Well, in my opinion, I don't think ego is necessarily always bad. I think ego can be a good thing. It can be if it's managed appropriately. I think ego is something that can help us step outside of our comfort zone. It can definitely help us to do some things that are challenging, provides us with some sort of motivation sometimes. And you always hear the phrase, well, it was to help boost your ego. Well, yeah, there's definitely certain things that happen in life where you maybe try to find small wins that can help you boost your ego. And so I think that's something that we can keep in mind there, that ego can be a good thing because it helps us, builds up our self-esteem. That can be a good thing. And that's why I also want to tie this back to the dichotomy of these two. Now, dichotomy, if you're not familiar with this word, dichotomy means basically the contrast of two things that are opposite or maybe different. Now, for me, the reason that I know dichotomy, and it's a bigger word or maybe a word that you maybe are not familiar with, but the reason that I know of that word is because of the book called The Dichotomy of Leadership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. If you have not read that one, that's a very good one. It's the same book or kind of the same outline as Extreme Ownership that those two people also wrote. So if you haven't read or listened to either one of those, I recommend listening to Extreme Ownership first and then The Dichotomy of Leadership. And essentially what that is talking about there has to be kind of a middle ground. Sometimes, some situations, you need to definitely listen to your ego, and maybe some situations you actually need to forget your ego and be more humble. And so I think there's definitely a dichotomy there, or a contrast between the two. And so that's why I think this phrase here is going to be extremely important, one that I think one can actually live by, become, say, a core value for you. I know it's something that I try to remember often. And so what that is being humbly confident. That is essentially the dichotomy as to what we're talking about. The ego versus being humble. And so that's where, if you talk about what's the opposite of ego, in my mind, I think it's being humble. Going back to what I said before, the higher the horse you're riding on, the harder the fault when life happens. So if you can keep yourself grounded a little bit, keep yourself a little bit closer to the ground so your horse isn't so high, like you're feeling you're just riding above everyone else, like you're better than everyone else. If you can keep yourself grounded, so to speak, you're going to keep yourself a little bit more humble. That's going to be less of a hard fall when reality in life actually happens. And so that's where I think there's a really important dichotomy there, a really important balance. Got to find that middle ground. And there's certain times in our life where I think we do need to listen to our ego. I think when it comes to stepping outside of our comfort zone, when it comes to doing something new, when it comes to doing something different, I think it's definitely important for us to sometimes listen to our ego, try to find things that boost our ego to push us in the right direction, but also to remember how we got there. What's the reason for that? Who's actually in control here? And that's where I think being humbly confident is a really good balance there. When you can come back to being humble and realizing that, we are blessed. Bring this back to my situation. As it sits, we got one field of corn left. We are blessed that we are where we are. We are blessed that the equipment has functioned properly. We are blessed that we've had a good harvest. It's been rolling along pretty fast. We've had good help. Everything's just been going good. This is just being honest. But also, I'm not responsible for that. Yes, there's decisions that we can make that help us to lead to where we are today. But at the end of the day, God's going to be in control. And I think that's to where if we can be humble, that's going to keep us more grounded. That's going to keep us to where when life happens, it's not going to be as hard as a fall, like I mentioned before. And so I think that can be really important for us to remember. And so the one thing that I'll say here is some takeaways that I was thinking about here is we need to do our best to get some perspective from maybe a higher level, maybe looking at your situation, maybe realizing that when it comes to going back to, say, some of the farming practices, like I mentioned before, it's good to be confident going into some of the decisions that we're trying to make in the farm. It's good to have a little bit of ego and self-esteem going into those, but at the same time, gain some perspective. Realize that maybe some criticism and some opposing views is not a bad thing. I think that's to where your ego can be a bad thing. Your ego is going to be the anesthesia that deadens the pain of stupidity when you don't take the opposition, those different views, that criticism that people might give you, and actually listen to that to a certain extent. When you just shove that aside, thinking that you're better than and they don't know anything else, when you're not willing to listen to some of those different things, that's to when ego can become a bad thing. And so that's another takeaway there is be open to criticism and opposing views. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to help you gain a little bit of perspective, maybe get you to see a different side of things. Maybe you get you to actually step back and maybe try to actually listen to the whispers. And so that's the next one there, kind of another takeaway is put yourself in the position to listen to the whispers of God. And I can say that one is sometimes easier said than done. Well, ultimately, it's always going to be easier said than done to put yourself in the position to listen to the whispers of God. And like I mentioned before, do your best to be humbly confident. Think about that. Remember, as we listen to this, as you get done listening to this and you go out throughout your day, try your best to be humbly confident. Have the confidence to go do the hard things. Have the confidence to go do something different, to make the decisions that you need to make and to make them with confidence, but then also realize that you're not always in control. And so if you do have success and you do well, be humble in that situation as well. And so, as I get to wrapping this up, full disclosure, this is a constant process. This is something that I am constantly working on. That's why I love recording these podcast episodes, because it's stuff that I'm thinking about in the current moment that I need to continue working on myself. So this is something that's always going to be a work in progress, and that's okay. That's okay. We need to remember that our ego is definitely going to get the best of us at some point. So we're definitely going to fall off that horse. But if we can do our best to be humbly confident in that situation, maybe we fall off the horse and we think, wow, we need to learn from that situation. I need to learn that, okay, I'm not necessarily in control, but I can continue to do my best to push forward and to continue to move forward with confidence and put yourself in the position to listen to the whispers of God. So I really hope this makes sense to you. I really hope this resonates for you. Let me know if there's something that struck home for you, because these are some things that I work through and I'd love to have a conversation about as well. And when it comes to ego, there's definitely contrast there and that we can work through. And so honestly, that's really all I got for today. So I hope you found this episode valuable, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram @GarrettRuskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.